we're going to do that, now would be a good time. Sorry, Danny, I didn't want to get too far into this without.
No,
No, thank you. I appreciate it. I started to do it a second ago and then Diane called again and they're having a whole thing, but it's recording. We're good.
okay. So, I don't think that, American Jewish life, or for that matter, Jewish life in general, would be that much without dispute. But we might ask, are there certain things that are beyond dispute? Are there things that we really shouldn't be arguing about, because after all, they're just, they're normal boundaries, right? I saw an article last week, which I think would be of, good interest, written by a Reform rabbi from Toronto, John Moskowitz, and it's about, the problems with liberal Judaism. And of course, as a Reform rabbi, he's very interested in that. And he said that one of the problems is that liberal Judaism is dedicated to identity formation and not a religious worldview, right? So think about that for a second and ask yourself, is that something that we could debate about? Are we teaching a religious worldview, or are we just teaching people to identify as Jews without much thought about what that commits you to, what that means? Right? What the premise of this course, and by and large, I subscribe to that premise. The premise is that Judaism, starting with the Hebrew Bible, continuing with the rabbinic tradition, continuing into modern Judaism, should not be read as dogma, but as a record of debates with which Jews struggled in ancient times, in the rabbinic period, and ever since. That is problematic for some people. I think there are people who want religion to represent itself as one truth, as a truth that, addresses all issues, all problems, and it's beyond dispute, right? I think that there are divisions in congregations over this issue. I found particularly that among many people who are Jews by choice, that they often come from a position of, religion is here to represent the truth. And the religion they came from, or the no religion they came from, it just wasn't the right truth. But they came to Judaism and they saw that, well, here's something that represents the truth. And they are sometimes disturbed to find that Judaism doesn't always represent one truth, but a series of truths, different understandings of the truth, different approaches to life. And so I think some of those people have a little bit of tension over that, because, here they are and they've committed their lives to what they understand as the truth that Judaism presents. And then they find out that that's not what Judaism really is. So we are going to explore a whole realm of disputes in Jewish history, in Jewish texts. We'll see just how some of those questions divide us and sometimes unite us. And some of the issues that we'll have to face are along the lines of, where is it okay for us to have diversity of opinions? And where is it necessary for us to have boundaries? Right? Those are, I think those will be the recurring questions as we come across different issues and different approaches to those issues. Let me stop right here and ask if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask at the outset. Yes, Daniel.
Let's comment. What some folks do that are looking for a one-way answer to replace their old religion look to the Orthodox or even ultra-Orthodox point of view. And it strikes me that the further right you go, the more you get this sort of almost authoritarian, this is the one true authentic Judaism. The number of times I've heard, well, what do the Orthodox say? As if that's some kind of standard that we deviate from.
Mm-hmm.
And I personally find that kind of disturbing that so many Jews would look at it that way.
Yeah, well, this has been my experience also with a number of people, even if they're not really part of the Orthodox community, don't want to be part of the Orthodox community, don't feel that they can live up to that standard, they nevertheless see it as the standard.
Mm-hmm.
And so
that seems to be particularly true among many secular Israelis. You know, the old adage, the only shul that I won't step foot into must be an Orthodox shul.
yes.
And if I can just comment, having participated over the last few years in the conversion process, sitting on Beit Din's Hatafat Dam, I found that many people who are Jews by choice come with a questioning attitude and an attitude that learning about Judaism is a lifelong process from here forward to them, which puts many Jews by birth to shame and means that our own commitment to Judaism doesn't withstand questioning when it arises because we've not asked the questions ourselves. So I think this is a wonderful class.
And just to make clear, I completely agree with you, Mark, and I am not, I would be the last one to paint the entire converted Jews, I prefer, with a single brush of saying they're looking for an alternative to an authoritarian religion
Yes,
that they come from.
but
that is not the case. Many come and carry on a tradition of questioning.
yes, so I think that among Jews by choice, just as among Jews who are born Jewish, you have both of these threads. You have people who thrive on debate and questioning and diversity of answers and approaches and even lifestyles. And then you have others who are looking for the one answer because they believe that's what religion should provide them. So that the fact that we have a diversity of approach is beyond dispute, right? And so we have to live with that and work with that. But it's important to understand why and within what parameters Judaism so values debate and dispute. So Jennifer, if you will, roll the video you have ready from Rabbi Daniel Nevins.
Can everybody see that? A culture of controversy?
Yes.
I can see it.
Yes.
The Jewish people is famously argumentative. It's a fact that we're frankly proud of. We look back to Abraham, our first patriarch, who argued with God over the fate of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. His daughter-in-law, Rebecca, went and spoke to God, arguing about the nature of her pregnancy. We have descriptions of Moses arguing with God when God announces the plan to wipe out the people of Israel in frustration while they're in the desert. And of course, we've got the daughters of Tzalafchad who argue with Moses, saying that it's unfair that their family's patrimony would be lost because their father had 5 daughters and no sons. And so in the Bible, we have examples of argumentation, but this really takes off in the rabbinic period. Every page of the Talmud has a big argument on it, and they're fascinating. As Jews argue with one another, they clarify the law. In fact, one of my favorite stories is about Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. When Reish Lakish dies, he was the famous arguing partner of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan was distraught, and his friends all came and found him another friend to argue with him. The problem was that this other replacement friend always agreed with him. He always said, "Oh, that's what you think? I've got a proof that will support you." He said, "I don't care about having proofs to support me." When Reish Lakish was around, he would give me all sorts of objections to everything I said, and I would argue back, and that's the way that the law became clarified. There's a famous sugya or lesson in the Talmud in Tractate Eruvin, where it says that the disciples of Shammai and the disciples of Hillel disagreed and argued for years on an important point of law. Finally, in the end, a heavenly voice was heard to say, "Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim, v'halacha kebeit Hillel." These and those are the words of the living God, but the law follows the disciples of Hillel. It's fascinating because it's saying that there was legitimacy to both points of view. And we always quote that part. We don't always quote the last part, which is that the law does have to be determined in the end. The community needs to know how to act. The rabbis asked, why was it that Beit Hillel's disciples won the day? And they said it's because they were better in the ethics of their argument. They would first give the opinion of their opponents, and they would explain that opinion well and respectfully, and then they would add their point of view and showed why they disagreed. This is why Beit Hillel triumphed in the argument. This history of argumentation, sometimes with bitterness, but more often with a sense that it's a machloket l'shem shamayim, a debate for the sake of heaven, continues to our day. In fact, in the conservative movement, we have an organization called the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, on which I sit. We've got 25 rabbis sitting around a table, plus 5 lay people and a cantor, and all of us engage in spirited debate on important issues of our day. I must say that when I write a paper and submit it for 25 rabbis and 5 lay people and a cantor to disagree with me on, it's a bit terrifying. But I can also tell you this, that in the process of listening closely to my colleagues, writing down their comments, and then going back and revising my draft, my work gets better. The Torah reflects more voices, more wisdom, and we, the Jewish people, benefit as a result.
Rabbi, you're muted.
Okay.
You're back.
So I want to add that I have never been asked to serve on the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. I would find it pretty awful in both senses of the word to have to submit my work to 25 rabbis. That sounds like a rabbinical student's nightmare. But, you know, for Rabbi Nevins, who actually deserves to be on the law committee, it's a way of growing. It's a way of learning and taking in the insights of other teachers and colleagues. So let me begin the discussion about this with a question. I want you to think about the last time you had an argument with someone, whether it was a friendly argument or not so friendly argument. Okay? Everybody have a clear? Okay, so how did you feel going into that argument? And what was your attitude towards the other person in the argument? And did you listen and respond to them? Or did you interrupt them? What was the experience like? Anyone? Yeah, Roberto.
Well, lately, I think probably most of us have arguments on politics right now, which is on fashion right now.
Can't understand why.
Why?
I get it, Roberto. Yes. So go ahead.
Anyway, but I mean, I've had discussions, discrepancies with people, and I think it's important to listen. I think in my point of view, it's important to listen what the other ones say before debating and arguing your point of view.
So was it like that for you in this last argument that you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Anyone else?
My last argument really wasn't an argument. It was whatever. There was a point made that was simply unfactual, and it was stated as a fact. And I was not patient. And I'm not proud of that. I'm just saying what happened. But there's a difference between stating falsehoods as facts and saying it is my opinion that, based on some kind of interpretation of a value system.
Mm-hmm. So how'd that work out, Daniel?
We both agreed to shut up because we were in a group and neither one of us wanted to disturb the peace of the group.
Uh-huh. I guess that's good. At least you agreed about something.
Liz is smiling. She knows exactly what happened.
And I think there was someone who intervened a little bit to keep the peace.
Thank you, Liz. We know that you are a peacemaker, so that's a good thing. Yeah. Anyone else?
Okay.
Please, Ronnie.
Should I come clean?
Absolutely.
I'm horrible when it comes to arguing because I'm always right.
Well, sure. Aren't we all?
I have a very hard time listening to someone else's opinion. I'm very, I don't know. I hold my views very, very close.
Can you hear it?
Mm-hmm.
It's just very hard for me to listen to someone else's opinion, especially when I think they're completely off base.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
How
very
often
bad.
does that happen, Ronnie?
It depends what the subject is.
Uh-huh. All right,
Yeah.
so you don't have to elaborate any more than you want to. Yeah. Well, I think this is true for more of us than we're willing to admit. I appreciate that you're willing to admit that, Ronnie. I mean, it's very difficult to remain patient and to listen to the arguments of the another person when we're already pretty convinced that those views don't have any merit. Right? So I think what we're going to see is that there are a whole range of issues on which it is perfectly acceptable to hold varying views. Right? Ronnie, give me an example of something where someone else's different viewpoint wouldn't necessarily evoke that kind of reaction from you. You have to unmute yourself first. There you go.
If it was just a casual acquaintance, but when it's someone near and dear, especially a family member, that's when it becomes very difficult.
Well, you know, the closer to home, the hotter the fire.
Right.
Yeah. What about issues? Are there issues where it just doesn't have that kind of fire for you, where you can disagree with them and it doesn't evoke this kind of reaction from you?
I'm trying to think, because there's two issues in my household right now that evoke a lot of frustration and anger. I'm trying to think if there's
Right. I
something.
mean, we can make a list of those too. What I'm looking for is the other kind.
The other kind. I mean, there's something as simplistic about, do you want to watch something on TV tonight? Different views about what we should watch, something like that.
Yeah, well, that's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm trying to think of something
That's a lot less existential, isn't it?
yes. I'm trying to come up with a.
Right. So the kind of thing I'm thinking of. All right. So, Judaism teaches certain things about the afterlife, but you're not necessarily bound to accept everything that is said. Or even if you do believe everything that is said, somebody may believe something different, but it doesn't evoke that kind of reaction from
Yes.
it, right? So let's say you believe in an afterlife, your cousin doesn't, but that doesn't get your goat.
Right.
Okay. So there are probably a whole host of issues like that it's not that they're not important, it's just that it doesn't grab you by the neck if somebody has a different viewpoint, right? I'm a conservative Jew, you're an Orthodox Jew, you're a Reformed Jew, right? But, I can believe what I believe and believe it very fervently, but at the same time, it doesn't evoke, the feeling that I need to, pull out a revolver and start shooting.
Right.
Right. And Liz, that it's good to have you around. If that ever happens, I know that I'm going to call on you. Okay. Okay. So, anybody else have something like this that they could share with us?
Yeah, I do. I find it kind of contrary to that on some levels. As a youngest sibling, I tend to defer to my older siblings' opinions on things to keep it simple. Now with my husband, and that then becomes a different issue. I've got a good sparring partner, which is quite possibly what I see it as, and certainly our kids would say that we spend a lot of verbal time.
Even when we agree.
Yeah, right. Kind of in that very Jewish, we can agree about something, but we're going to argue the little fine points of it. Yes. And it's part of in my case, it becomes part of how I deal with people. Not always well, and I don't always, the closer I am, kind of like Ronnie, those are the ones that I'm going to keep going, and I want to hear my opinion at least heard and validated. And I find it interesting that with my family, my siblings, I take a very different approach than I do with my friends, as it were.
Siblings do have a different grab at us, don't they?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. In some families, it's really it's good that, our siblings are all spread around, right? Geographic distance, a little bit of, emotional distance.
Yeah, no, it helps everyone be their own person, to be sure. Because I know when we get together, we all kind of revert to whatever childhood people we were.
Right. And yet there are some issues where it just doesn't matter. If somebody disagrees with us, it's a real effort to discuss it in a calm fashion. Ronnie, you understand this, don't you? Yeah. Well, I do too. Yes, Daniel.
Sometimes when you are debating with someone with whom you were in an intimate relationship, and intimate, I simply mean very close, close friends, partners, family members, genetically related people, the subject that's being argued about is not what you're really arguing about, if that makes any sense. I think the psychologist here would know what I'm talking about. There's issues, personal dynamics, and that can really complicate dealing with, saying that you're not going to be emotional, saying that you're going to deal with facts. The subject on the table, whether or not the dishwasher is loaded correctly, is a famous example. That's not what you're arguing about. You're arguing about power. You're arguing about, roles. You're arguing about bigger things. And it's almost disingenuous when you're talking to someone who always have got this passive aggressive almost talking about dishwashers and things like that when they're really talking about something else.
Yes. So that's one of the challenges that we have in all sorts of issues, to try to take the power out of it and to just deal with it, as a very detached kind of issue, with whether you're talking about it on its merits or not. So switching the focus onto issues of Jewish import and what our Torah and what our tradition have to say about those issues, I would say that even in those realms, sometimes the power issue gets in the way a little bit. In other words, that even though you have great sages of antiquity dealing with, very important and sometimes abstract issues, but nonetheless, the relationships between them occasionally get in the way of the most fruitful possible discussion. And it's in that sense that I want to show you this first text from our source material for today. Okay? The background on this, in many rabbinic sources, Torah study is described as the war of Torah. Okay? It was that there's a lot of competition in the discussion of certain issues. And, if we value the idea of collaboration and cooperation, then sometimes we run up against people who say, well, we're not interested in cooperation and collaboration. We want to close down this other opinion. We want to show that that opinion is meritless, right? And so dispute there, it gets very heated. So here's the text from this midrash that appears 3rd or 4th century. It begins with this verse from Kings, Kol giborim osei milchama, all of them valiant wagers of war. So the question is asked, what valor can people who are going into exile display? Because that's the context of the end of the book of Kings, right? When you're going into exile, you've been beaten. You lost the war. So what war can people wage when they are fettered in shackles and bound by chains? Rather, it says valiant refers to those who are valiant in Torah study. Now, you just have to leave out the fact that this is clearly not the intent of the original text of Scripture. This is a very deliberate rereading of that, right? And it quotes a verse from Psalm 103, "Bless the Lord, O you his angels, valiant and mighty, who do his word." So that's valiant. What does wagers of war mean? That refers to those who are engaged in dialogue and debate, give and take. It says, nosim v'notnim, those who, like they push and pull, they give and take in the war of Torah, in the debate about Torah. And it quotes a verse from the Torah, "Wherefore it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord." Okay? Now, how do you all like this version of war as a model for the for debate about ideas? Anybody have a thought about that? Yes, Liz.
I mean, when I think about war, I usually think about bloody and killing and trying to annihilate the other person.
Right. Well, this is a Jewish group, so
Right. Well, we don't want to annihilate, but in this sense, you're annihilating. If you think about war in that sense, you're annihilating what their opinion is, and it doesn't always convey a sense of respect for the opinion of the other person, even though one may win out as the law, and the other may not, but there's still not that respect when you think about war.
Right. And therefore, this approach has a problem with it, right? It may not be the best model for discussion of certain ideas. Is the goal to get at a right answer or a more right answer, or is the idea to pin your opponent on his back?
Well, yeah, war of words remains a common metaphor to this day.
Yes. And some people seem to like that, don't they?
I also see this particular interpretation as the assumption is there is one way, one answer, and that it is a very universal one truth. And I find that counter to so much of what I know of Judaism and how life in general works for.
Right. So we're gonna come to that, right? But I just, I wanted to show you this particular text because, it's also part of the tradition. That yes, we do have a tradition of knock down, drag out, bloody, beat your opponent in the head kind of debate. It's the wars of the Lord, right? But when we put it that way, we recognize that there are problems with that. Right? So, other thoughts about this text?
So what do you do if you honestly feel you're coming in to the debate with at least some open-mindedness that you could change your mind, but your opponent is in a war frame of mind? They lie, they deceive, they simply do not wish to engage in a discussion, how do you react to that? Do you stay in it and do your best? Or do you do what I'm more inclined to do more recently, is just throw up my hands and say it's not worth it and walk away and find somebody who's a good friend or find
Yeah,
somebody who's a good debate partner?
I've done both of those, Daniel. I think all of us have, sometimes we have participated in those kinds of discussions where we didn't really feel we were getting anywhere. And at some point you throw up your hands and say, well, goodbye, right? And sometimes, if you can, you simply approach the issue with a certain amount of calm, and you try to bring the facts as you understand them to bear on the discussion, even though you probably won't change somebody's mind.
I think in terms of the famous line, you pick your battles. And I think in dealing with people, often you decide is this one worth going down that road for, or just let's walk on down and do something else.
Yeah, live to fight another battle. And sometimes, you don't fight that battle. So some people are always fighting the wars of the Lord. And maybe there are areas where that's a good approach, but it definitely has problems, right? So that's the substance of this text, this approach. Let's take a second approach. And we'll go to the next text here. This is taken from a halachic work, Aruch HaShulchan, written late 19th century. So here is what he says about these kinds of divisions and debates. It says, truly, for one who understands a matter in all its richness, all the controversies among the Tanaim, Amoraim, the Geonim, those the authorities in different eras, and the decisors of Jewish law, those the people who have to make decisions about the law today, they are the words of the living God, and all are grounded in the law. Indeed, this is the glory of our pure and holy Torah, the whole of which is called a song. And the glory of the song is that the individual voices differ from one another. This is the essence of its delight. And one who explores the Sea of Talmud will experience the diverse delights of all these distinct voices. So my first question after this is, since he calls this process of debate and discussion a song, have you ever participated in a debate that felt like that was actually uplifting and added to the understanding of both sides? So if you have, can you talk about what that was like a little bit?
Yes. Last year, there was a series of interfaith dialogues it was being sponsored by Beth Yeshurun.
Mm-hmm.
And we sat at tables with Christians and with Muslims and with Jews. And I found everyone was very respectful, listened to each other's views, and I came away with a far deeper knowledge, especially within the Muslim community, what they believed. It was very enlightening, and there was no arguments. It was really a beautiful experience.
Yeah. And there wasn't a war involved, right?
No,
There
there was no
wasn't a
war.
need to make our opinion the capital T truth.
Nope.
Right?
Mhm.
That's a great example. Anyone have another one?
It's an interesting metaphor when he talks about the different arguments between the rabbis is look at it as the song with different voices. Because when I was studying Talmud in elementary school and high school, our rabbi taught with the sing-song cadence and also with the finger to make the point. But it's a very traditional way of making the Talmudic arguments. It's sort of with a sing-song chant. Even though those arguments are sometimes across generations, the Talmud compiles arguments from people that didn't even live in the same era, but makes it seem like they're in the same room exchanging ideas, which itself is an interesting phenomena. Almost like today, you can put together a harmony of people in this era of Zoom, people in different areas, different continents, and then they put it all together and make one harmony. I think it's particularly interesting in the previous text, it talks about the book of the wars of God, which is a book that's been lost to us. We don't know that book. So you would think that by tradition, it's the wars that God waged on behalf of the Jewish people. You would think that would be a pretty important text. We've lost that one. Battle's not so important, but we certainly have preserved through all the tractates of the Talmud. Anybody that has the Steinsaltz collection knows how big that is. We've preserved the arguments, which may mean that the verbal dueling without actual bloodshed may be more part of our tradition than the actual bloodshed.
Yeah. That's a great observation, Mark. Thank you. That we and would that all of our arguments could be like that, could be uplifting for us, right? Anyone else have an example to share? Yeah, Daniel.
Yeah, I think it comes down to trust. If I argue with another Jew about Israeli politics, Palestinians, whatever, there is a different argument going on there because I trust them that I would have with someone who doesn't have skin in the game, if you will. I trust that other person, and I hope they trust me, that we both are looking for the best interest of the state and the Jewish people. But sometimes if I'm arguing with someone I don't trust, then it's very difficult to sing with them. Very difficult. There's always going to be this boundary.
Well, I'm glad that's been your experience about discussions relating to Israel. In fact,
sometimes
that's a subject that often evokes precisely the opposite. One of the first headlines of 2020 in the Jewish press was, "This year, let's debate everything except Israel." Right? Said they should have a moratorium on discussing Israel and renew commitment to Jewish life by debating everything else. Right? But at least some people saw that as too volatile to talk about. And maybe in some groups of Jews it is, or at least it feels like that. I would not have predicted that a generation ago, but clearly it's problematic now. Yeah. Anyone else have an experience like this? Yeah, Lou.
Not an experience, but an opinion, if I can. So the first sentence of this section talks about or infers that there are multiple sides to the issue, whatever the issue is. And I'm thinking about the Jewish my observation of the Jewish response to the pandemic in terms of ritual and how to continue to engage each other in Jewish ritual and prayer when we can't be in the synagogue together. And for the most part, that's been ultimately widely accepted across the Jewish world, although not completely, but certainly mostly. And I think to me, it's very encouraging.
Okay. Thank you, Lou. Anyone else? Okay, so let me take you into the next text, which we will probably not finish discussing today, but I want to leave you with it because I think this is going to be very important for how we approach higher discussion. Okay, so text number 3 is this teaching from Pirkei Avot, okay, which is every dispute that is for the sake of heaven is destined to endure. But if it is not for the sake of heaven, it is not destined to endure. What is an example of a dispute for the sake of heaven? The dispute of Hillel and Shammai. In other words, the arguments that Hillel and Shammai and their schools carried out. What is an example of a dispute not for the sake of heaven? The dispute of Korach and all his congregation. Right? So hopefully most of you know the story of Korach in the book of Numbers. Korach, who challenged the authority of Moses and ultimately wound up being swallowed into the earth. Okay? So this text is one of the most famous rabbinic passages about dispute. And what it says is that dispute in and of itself is extremely positive. Okay? Now, some disputes carry on through time. They carry on through generations, right? And many of the disputes of the school of Hillel and Shammai are things that, still carry on to today. Right? Now, some people might say, well, the school of Shammai is wrong. So why would their disagreement be seen as positive? Can't we just resolve the controversy, vote on it, and decide that this is the right way once and for all? Right? So we'll see in other texts that there are times when certain things get resolved, and there are times when the dispute simply carries on, the tension lives on through the generations. Right? Comments and observations. Anyone have a thought about this?
Only in the tradition of arguing, I'm pretty certain that the citation from Pirkei Avot is chapter 5, number 19, not 17. But
there are different editions of Pirkei Avot, Mark.
Okay, just because
they just didn't have the same edition as yours.
Okay, because
they
this
just
was one
divide
that
up
was
the Mishnayot differently.
Right. This was one that was ingrained in us. But it occurs to me that on the previous section, when you talked about let's have a moratorium on arguing about Israel, it's clearly one that even affected the conservative movement in the most recent Siddur. The blessing for the state of Israel, which has been around for quite a few years, talks about the beginning of our redemption. This edition, it inserts in parentheses that it should be the beginning of our redemption. In other words, among the editors of the Siddur, out of the conservative movement, there was already this tension of, is the return to Israel, regardless of who's sitting in government, is the actual return to Israel the beginning of the redemption, God's hand? Or is it, this is not really it, because look how not good it is politically in Israel. So maybe it is good that if even the editors of the conservative movement's most widely used Siddur now can't agree about Israel, maybe some issues need to be set in abeyance for argument. Hillel Shammai asked everybody to argue, argued about everything, but maybe since we can't approach their level of being erudite and hopefully conciliation, maybe we do really need to mute some of our arguments that may arouse passions that are too strong and that may ultimately lead to division.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up, Mark. There's, my observation about this new Siddur, Siddur Lev Shalem of the conservative movement, is that it represents a shift in the way that we view particularism. In Judaism, there's always this tension between we are the Jewish people and we are God's beloved people and God's chosen people. And on the other hand, the earth is the Lord's, and, every human being is created in the image of God. God cares about all people equally, right? So how do you manage that tension, right? That's a problem. And this Siddur definitely shifts certain things in the direction of universalism and a little bit away from particularism. Something as simple, for instance, as the inclusion in the text, which has become more common in many minyanim, in the Kaddish Shalem, where we add, says Shalom b'mamav hu yaseh Shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, and then some people include v'al kol yoshvei tevel, and all those who dwell on earth. All right? So, if people feel that we need to be more universalistic, then we need to add prayers that are universalistic. And so we insert that phrase into the Kaddish. And if you don't feel so universalistic, then maybe you don't feel the need to make that change. And after all, you have to have a reason to make a change. And is the reason compelling? Right? So there are a number of texts like that within the Siddur, and this very tiny addition in the translation, it's not in the original text, but in the translation of the prayer for the state of Israel, it says, maybe we will be the beginning of the redemption. That's the way it should be, but maybe we don't see it happening right now. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to take a 5-minute break, and then we will, have our 11 o'clock classes. Those of you who are joining me for that, I think it's on a different channel, but glad to have you all here and look forward to continued discussion and debate about debate and discussion.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay,
Thank you, Rabbi Herbert.
thank you all.
Thank you very much.